Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And today is day 194 since the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 individuals, including elderly men, women, children, and infants. 133 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren, and before we touch on the main question, and that is when Israel may retaliate, and if so, with what, I'd like first to focus on a couple of points, and the first one is Lord David Cameron, U.S. Foreign Secretary, visited Jerusalem today, met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu before heading to Ramallah for his meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. And while in Jerusalem, he highlighted that Hamas had a good deal on the table and yet refused to take it and laid the blame on this Islamist terrorist organization. Subsequently, also during a joint press conference between the Qatari Prime Minister and his Romanian counterpart, the Qatari Prime Minister, who also holds the foreign ministerial portfolio, emphasized that the situation right now is somewhat precarious when it comes to the negotiations. What can you tell us about the situation at hand?
So, the Gaza war seems to be off center stage right now. It's in a lull after the storm stage, perhaps another storm to come if and when Israel does decide to go into Rafah. Now, the hostage deal, as presented by the mediators having talked with Israel to Hamas, is probably a very good one for all sides, except for one matter. Israel keeps saying that the follow-up to the deal would be killing the Hamas leaders who sign on. So what incentive does Yahya Sinwar have to let the hostages go, knowing full well that this is how he writes his own obituary? So there's a problem in fine-tuning this particular detail. Perhaps by reawakening the old, let Sinwar go in exile rather than face certain death. Now, the Israeli Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, has visited new inductees, new recruits, because obviously the Israel Defense Forces must still absorb new 18-year-olds as older ones are discharged from conscription and go immediately into the reserves during war. And Halevi said that liberating the hostages is a noble mission worth fighting for. And that is remarkable because he's putting this particular mission above the other one of getting rid of Hamas as a military and governmental force in Gaza.
Indeed. With that being said, of course, we always need to keep in mind that without moving Hamas, of course, there are various solutions that can be formulated, and I'll leave that for the political establishment at hand with all of its own challenges. The threat emanating from the Gaza Strip will return to the way it was before the October 7th massacre in the long term, and therefore concrete actions need to be taken and a policy for that must be formulated. But let's now turn to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, Brigadier General Doron Gavish. It's good to see you again, General. I'd like to turn our attention to the northern front, vis-a-vis Lebanon. We saw, unfortunately, a number of unmanned aerial vehicles targeting northern Israel today, causing a number of casualties, various degrees of injuries. What can you tell us about that? And while all eyes are eastward, are we losing focus on the other fronts?
Well, indeed, Jonathan, this is the challenge that the IDF and, of course, the Air Force and the Air Defense have in the last few months, I have to say. It is not something new that we have to look at different directions. So I wouldn't say that what happened today, it's something which is reflecting from the situation. As we always said, there is no hermetic defense. Sometimes some of those protections, they do go in, but this is something that we always talk about. We always are being prepared to it, and sometimes our enemies succeed in what they are trying to do. This is the way of this fight. But overall, we have to remember that the vast majority of the threats coming from the Gaza Strip, from the Hezbollah, also from Iran, from Yemen, from other places, the vast majority of them are being intercepted, and this is the full concept that, of course, we have to look at. But we are in a war. And this is always a reminder when something like this happens. It's a reminder that we are in a war. During a war, there are some casualties. Unfortunately, there is no 100%.
Of course, unfortunately, nothing is hermetic, but nonetheless, the Israeli Air Force missile and air defense has really outdone itself over the course of these 6 months, defending Israeli citizens across the board and doing so vigilantly. I'd like to immediately now turn to a former Israeli Air Force commander, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Relik Shafir. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to immediately ask you about preparatory work undergoing within the Israeli Air Force, but the IDF at large as well, to ensure that the strike by Iran on the night between Saturday and Sunday will not go unanswered.
The preparations are obviously, if the Air Force is to act at that long range, have to do with training the pilots in not only a long mission, but a mission that requires tanking from taking fuel from airplanes at low level and such things that we won't go into tactically. But the Israeli Air Force had trained for the last maybe 13 years for a kind of mission where it can deliver a credible operational attack in the Iranian arena. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the action will be taken by the Air Force, and it doesn't mean that it'll be taken in the near future. I'll remind ourselves that for the last 10 years, we have been hitting Iranian targets in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, who are proxies of Iran in all manners, almost on a weekly basis. And the Iranians had contained this as their philosophy is to serve vengeance cold. And Israel may be clever to use the fact that at this time we have the support of Western countries who took part in the defense, and those who are just cheering on the side who are supporting Israel at this time. So diplomatically, it would be a good idea to use that support to enhance Israel's interests in Gaza. But on the other hand, after so many promises were made that this would not stay unanswered, there needs to be some kind of a retaliation, not necessarily on Iranian soil, but if it does take place on Iranian soil, it'll probably be with without hitting civilians, maybe a punitive strike on a base a far-off base, something not in the center that would be bold enough to say, yes, we've struck back as a warning, but without putting Iran in a position where it has to strike back, and we're going in a back and forth situation, and who knows where it's going to end. We won't be able to take the United States and other supporters with us to that strike, and that would cause damage to Israel's interests. So it has to be a very fine line. Maybe Iran's proxies, either in Iraq or in Syria, in something that is more than we used to do, but not beyond an area or a threshold that will cause a back and forth firing, and Israel will lose its present support, which perchance took place and allows us to think strategically further ahead.
Absolutely. I think it's worth mentioning remarks made by retired General David Petraeus, who was also director of CIA, yesterday during an interview when he actually emphasized that the question if to retaliate or not is always from where you sit. If you sit in Washington and you're worried about the oil prices spiking, as the IMF just warned about prospects of escalation driving the oil prices up and other economic implications during an election year, you may not want to retaliate, and you would caution for restraint. But from Jerusalem's perspective, which he also personally holds and has emphasized, it needs to retaliate, and it needs to do so as a signal and not as a revenge strike, as one may highlight. But nonetheless, Israel does not usually operate, or at all, I hope so, at least from my understanding, from a revenge perspective, and does things in cold blood, if I may call it that way. But nonetheless, I'd like to turn now to the commander of the former chief of the intelligence directorate for the Mossad, also senior commander in the IDF intelligence directorate, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Amnon Sofri, and it's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you also particularly about the various tools at our disposal to bring about a reality in which, on the one hand, to avoid a regional escalation, which nobody wants, and it's been quite clear, nor do the partners of Iran, namely China and Russia, want to see the situation in the Middle East bogged down in a vigorous war between Israel and, of course, with the backing of Western nations against one of their main partners in the region, if not the main partner in the region. And therefore, how would you go about this? There is the biblical verse, of course, without schemes or cunning, a nation shall fall, and salvation will come from good advice. Our allies and partners are advising us to restrain, but are the considerations domestically for them impaling the schemes and cunning that Israel needs to follow up on?
Let me look at it from another angle. When you look at the strategic situation that we are now in the midst of, there is a major change between Iran and Israel. The fact that Iran decided to attack Israel directly for the first time in history from its own soil, not by proxies, not by any other messenger, but for itself, meaning retaliation. That means you are going to hit back with missiles, with APCs, with UAVs, and with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, of course. And the fact that we do that is only for one thing: we take revenge, or we respond to what you did to us in Damascus, meaning the killing of these 7 officers, including Mr. Yazadi, the High Commissioner of Quds Forces inside the Quds Forces in Syria and Lebanon, of course. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact that they decided to do that changed the whole equation. That means we are no longer striking each other below the water. We are now on the water, up, and we are fighting each other directly, and everybody sees it, and everybody is worried about it and concerned about it. Each one for its own consideration, of course. If we are going to strike Iran very hard, they are going to pay back, and this will be an ongoing dispute between us and them, and the conflict that will drag us to another area that we don't want to get mixed right now with inside that. That means that Israel cannot hold together a conflict in Gaza on the northern front with the Houthis in Yemen, and in addition to that, to turn Iran to be the main front of the conflict between us and them. Therefore, we have to be very careful. We have to calculate our response. That means we have to do something that will give a sign that we are not, of course, we have to pay back in some way, but without dragging the whole area into a huge conflict. That means it can be done on three courses of action. The first one is by what we call, uncovered activities, like my former colleagues know how to do that, but it doesn't leave a sign. So it's easy to conceal it and to ignore each other, that it is agreed that we pay the price, but with no huge damage. The second one is to use the Air Force on different angles and different missions, which will, in the end, if we're not calculating very well our activities, it will drag the whole area into a huge conflict. And the third one is to hit some of the proxies in Iraq or in Syria, and to send some message in Iran as well, on the Iranian soil, and to say, okay, this is the message we want to deliver, and be careful, not to retaliate anymore.
Indeed. Mr. Owen, I'd like to hear your take on the remarks earlier today by Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. He came out and once again declared boastfully, with a parade and show of similar weaponry that was utilized for the attack against Israel, that if Israel would try to retaliate for its strike on Israeli territory, it would immediately strike at Israel with a devastating blow. Do we need to take them seriously for that? And if so, does the United States and other Western allies that are already diverting some of their strong power into the region to further bolster their capabilities, to prepare for the worst?
All threats must be taken seriously, and we have relearned this lesson on October the 7th. We can't be complacent. But it seems as if Raisi spoke out of fear, and this bravado was a very thin disguise for the concern that Iran has. It knows that it's vulnerable, it's a vast country, many targets, almost to the adversary speaking. But let me expand on something that General Shafir said regarding the utility of using the Iran crisis in order to solve the Gaza problem, which Israel has. Imagine if a couple of weeks ago, instead of striking at the Iranian office in Damascus and killing the occupants, a special force managed capture Mahdavi or Zahedi, whatever his name was, on his tombstone, and himself and his half a dozen colleagues back to Israel in order to trade them for the hostages in Gaza. This would have been much better, but it's not too late to think of something like that.
General Gavish, I'd like to immediately turn to you. Preparatory work, obviously, is ongoing on a daily basis. Lessons learned from the initial strike of Iran on the night between Saturday and Sunday. Is this too early for lessons learned, or is the R&D being implemented right now into the various systems to already withstand additional attacks in the near future?
Well, Jonathan, the lesson learned started 30 seconds after the end of this salvo. This is the DNA of the Israeli Air Force, and we do it every time. And so lesson learned is something which, again, it's part of the DNA. The idea is, of course, the operators themselves. They look on their mission. Everyone writes down what he did for the best and what he could be improving. And this is what we are doing. This is the first circle, I would say. The second circle is you look on the doctrine. Do you have to do any adaptations to the doctrine itself? And then, of course, to the systems. This is also something that is being looked at. So debriefing, this is something which is crucial during such a war. Of course, we have to remember that Israel basically stands against the largest combined attack of missiles, UAVs, and cruise missiles, all together more than 300 of them, unprecedented in the world history. And so for sure, there is something to learn from it. We are learning from our mistakes. We are learning from what we are doing in a way that we need to fix it, but we also learning from what we did right. So this is the idea. This is the full process. But for sure, we are preparing ourselves to whatever would be needed. This is again what the Air Force is doing. There are all kinds of options. All the options are in the table. Some of them were mentioned by my colleagues here for sure. This is the war that we have to be smart. This is the war that we have to, breathe before we do something to make sure that we are making the right decision. I used to have a commander. His name was Idol Pushtan, commander of the Air Force, that he had a statement saying that I don't remember that I made a mistake by thinking twice about something that I had to do. So I think also here it's okay to think twice and to make sure that we are doing the right decisions. It's super complicated. There are very options. There is the tactic level, but there is the operational capabilities and then the strategic applications of it. I think General Sofrin was fully right. This is a different paradigm. We are in a different era. This is for the first time that there was a direct attack by Iran. So I fully agree with this statement on this, and we have to think differently.
General Shafir, you earlier mentioned 13 years of training with regard to the possibility of a long strike far away, potentially in Iran, of course. But this happened also in the 80s when a strike on the Osirak nuclear reactor happened. I will not speak about any affiliations to that operation, but when we're talking about lessons learned 30 seconds after that strike on the Osirak, which neutralized Iraqi capacity to enrich uranium at that point, what lessons can we learn from back then? And of course, we're talking about a different scale.
Of course, it's a different scale, different story, different targets that would require returning, or at least if we're talking about the nuclear program, a superiority for weeks over Iran, air superiority, and repeated attacks on the nuclear sites, the two main big ones, by bombers. Just to remind ourselves, the B-1, B-2 bombers carry 25-pound bunker busters and would be used repeatedly to dig a hole into the targets, whereas the fighter aircraft such as the F-15 are limited to about 3,000-pound bombs to deliver. So the kinetics are there as well. And that is why the Israeli Air Force is not a strategic Air Force in the sense that the U.S. Air Force has a strategic bomber force. So this is just to highlight a few small points that to the untrained ear may not sound important, but they are important in what we're talking about, the scale of attack. So we're talking about a more limited attack. It doesn't have to be by fighter aircraft. It could be done by other means that we won't go into that. In the 1981 Iraq mission, we had trained for 6 months on the attack itself. We knew pretty well what the target was. It was an external nuclear plant that had no bunkers at all. And the threat was from ground-to-air missiles. The idea is what we call in the Air Force KISS. Keep it simple and stupid. Not stupid in the sense that not thinking of, but not too complicated. You don't rely on too many things that can fail on the way, and so you need to really meticulously plan this in order not to suffer setbacks. In this particular case, if the Air Force does go into this mission, it must be secured that we do not create damage to ourselves in any way on the way to do that kind of a mission. At this particular time, if I was asked, I would say this is not a good time to carry an attack, a complicated attack on Iraq.
Indeed. Well, General Sofin, we don't have very much time left, roughly 2 minutes for you. So briefly, if I may, when you look specifically to the Islamic Republic of Iran and its various proxies around the region, the Mossad can deliver plenty of various activities, of course, that will never come to light. Would that not send the wrong signal, though? Because we want to let Iran know, also the public know potentially, that any enemy trying to challenge Israel, irrespective of what enemy that is, there will be a retaliation.
You can carry out such an attack without what we call a very high signature, but to accompany that with a message that will make clear that Israel is beyond this attack, and that will bring to the public, and of course the public in Israel, and of course to the Islamic Republic of Iran and to the other proxies, the message that Israel can do many things, and this is only a demonstration of our capabilities, and beware, because we can do much more regarding that issues.
Of course, this is some sort of escalation dominance, with this latter, of course, remaining within the conventional munition spectrum. But I'd like to thank General Sofrin, General Shafir, and General Gavish, and Mr. Oren, of course, for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.